So in continuing with the Timothy training with fruitful leaders and the quarterly iron on iron, one of the tools we found helpful for diagnosing health within a movement of multiplying disciples and groups and churches is what we call a generational map, where we're really trying to track the health of the disciples and the groups and the churches as we're seeing multiplication to fourth generation and beyond. Because once we see things multiply beyond fourth generation, it's a movement that cannot be controlled. And so the primary tool that we need to utilize for this is what we would call the church circle. If it's a group, it's a dotted line, but if it's identifies as church, we make it a solid line. And there's a few things that we want to identify in there. How many people are in the church? How many of them are believers? And how many of them have been baptized? Specifically, baptized believers, and then in parentheses, who would be the newly baptized believers since, because sometimes we have existing Christians that have been baptized in there. And then we want to just report if the functions of the healthy church that we see from Acts 2 are taking place. If they are, and they've been released, then we want to put them inside the circle. If they're not, we'll leave them out. So for example, a baptism, if they have the freedom to baptize and are baptizing, we put that in there. If they're praying, put that in there. If we see the gospel going out and them making disciples, we'll put that symbol in there. Are they loving one another? Put that in there. Do they have the freedom and the understanding of how to worship together and worship through perseverance? Are they able to do the Lord's Supper together? Are they celebrating that? Are they giving sacrificially? Have they figured out what that looks like and how to do that practically as a church? Are they continuing in long-term discipleship from the Word of God? And lastly, do they have biblically qualified leaders appointed? And again, that solid line, are they gathering? And we found it helpful to see the name of the church or the group, identify the location, what city or what area are they in locally, who started this. The reason why this is helpful is if we start to see a bunch of groups or churches downstream that are started by the same person, that's not really multiplication. That's just a bunch of other generational groups just started in that same generation. When was the start date? So we can see the age of these. Who are the elders or the leaders, if any, we can contact. And lastly, if you've got a treasurer, that's something that we have found. Again, some of these things might just be preferential, but I think definitely the name of the church gives it identity, where's it at, and who started it is especially important. So let's say this would be, you've got 32 believers or 32 people, and 27 of them are believers, and we then have 27 baptized, and of those 27 baptized, 12 of them are newly baptized believers. So we had a number of them that were already believers, and we see the functions in here, and we'll call this sample church. And the location is somewhere, and it was started by a guy named Jesus. That's fun. Started on January 2000, and the elders are Bob and Larry, and the treasurer is Jim. I'm just using it hypothetically, so we can learn something about this. Now, if this is a church that was started with existing believers, we would call that, because we're tracking generations here. Some people would say that's generation 1, some would say it's generation 0. Whatever the generation is, we typically will put it here, generation 1 or generation 0. And then any groups or disciples that the folks who are here begin to start or lead would come down into this next generation. let's say somebody from here leads their people to Christ from work, and they haven't yet identified as a church. It's a group. Okay, so we've got 6 people there, and they've got 3 believers in there, and 3 of them are baptized believers, and 2 of them are newly baptized believers. And we've got baptism in there, and a few weeks in, they're praying, and these new believers are sharing the gospel. They are learning to love one another. They haven't actually gone through the worship command yet, so they're not worshiping through perseverance. They haven't yet done the Lord's Supper. They haven't, typically, if they haven't gone through the command yet, these won't happen. Or if they haven't released it or figured it out. The long-term discipleship, they're in the Word. And now as we're planning churches, we as the planners serve as the elder, but we're looking also to raise up elders from in the community. So you could put it in there if they're like, wait a minute, we don't have an elder? Yeah, we do. It's the planter. And then, name, well, it's just neighborhood study. So you see, I'm not going to take the time, but you can see you fill that stuff in there. And if this is a generation 1, then this would be generation 2. And whether it's a group, or let's say out of here you get a church that started, and there's 12 people in it, and 9 of them are believers with 9 baptized believers, and 6 of them have been newly baptized, and man, they're doing baptism, and they're praying, and they are making disciples, and they're loving one another and worshiping the Lord, and they're celebrating the Lord's Supper together. But they've gone through the giving commandment. They haven't figured out the giving part yet. They're looking at the Word for long-term discipleship, and they're still working on raising up an elder. So if somebody were to, out of this church start, and you put all the information, if they were to then go and to lead somebody to Christ, then you would move it down in here into this 3rd generation. And if somebody were to, up in this group, train another believer, then and start another group, well, we would, until we see the kingdom expand among lostness, we keep it in the same generation. So believers training other believers, we celebrate that, we need that, but we would put those parallel. And if it's not identified as a church, it's a group. So we ask them to map these out and track. Whether it's an individual, that's fine. You could have one person over here. It's you and somebody else, and there's 2 believers, and you've both been baptized, but they're not newly baptized. And as you're going through the commands and releasing authority and practice, you can put these things inside or outside. I do want to say this. So you can do these on paper, and in a lot of countries where they don't have technology, you need to do this on a piece of paper. And obviously, I've run out of room here, but there is a Gen Mapper app that is extremely helpful if you've got Wi-Fi and connection, and you can find this app at NoPlaceLeft.net. It is extremely helpful. We highly recommend this Gen Mapper app, because you can plug your information and it syncs in with the broader NoPlaceLeft family and community, and gives us information of what's happening where. And it saves you a lot of time. People often create these gen maps and then they lose them and they got to create them all over again. They're easy to share. But the whole purpose of this, it's not reporting. The whole purpose of this is diagnosing health, the health of the disciples, the health of the churches and groups, and that we see generational growth is happening. And so this becomes a very helpful tool as we're in an iron on iron time together of being able to speak into stuckages to help people move forward towards healthy movement that we can see no place left. This is the generational map.